What's wrong with the world? If you ask 100 people, you'll get 100 different answers. We all sense that things are not quite right. In the book of Genesis, after the opening creation accounts, we read about how a number of things went wrong. We read about the first murder, about cohabitation between heavenly and earthly beings, about the confusion of languages. All these stories show how quickly, according to the author, things went awry. Humans were living out the worst side of their personalities and no longer seemed connected to God. Selfish ambition was driving many events. Listen as Peter Enns guides us through the early chapters of Genesis before the arrival of Abraham, the person who became the agent of God's redemption.
In Genesis chapters 3 through 11, we read some of the best-known stories of all of the Old Testament. Adam, Eve, and the serpent, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel. These stories are very familiar to Jews and Christians, but also to many others as well. In fact, some of these stories have made their way into everyday English usage. Think of the Apple computer logo, an apple with a bite taken out of it, no doubt symbolizing Adam and Eve partaking of the tree of knowledge. The phrase, "Am I my brother's keeper?" spoken by Cain after he murdered his brother, is a common expression of complaint. The title of John Steinbeck's book, East of Eden, and the movie starring James Dean are taken right from Genesis 4:16. To babble means to speak incoherently, a term derived from the Tower of Babel story. And those of us who grew up in the 70s certainly get the connection between the tower referred to as a stairway to heaven and the famous rock anthem of the same name. And what child in the Western world is not familiar with some depiction of the animals on Noah's Ark? Even though our society often has little or no understanding of the biblical origins of these expressions, the fact that they are so common is an indication of how influential these stories have been in our culture. But for students of the Bible, these stories are not just the stuff of pop culture or children's picture books. These stories in Genesis are, in their own right, powerful theological messages that are central to the whole Bible. Some obstacles for modern readers of Genesis 3 through 11, however, are the questions these stories raise about which ones are history and which are story, and what difference that makes. This can be a difficult issue for modern readers. And rather than give simplistic answers to some very difficult questions, let's set aside such questions for now and focus on what the stories teach about God and His people. Recall last week's reading in Genesis 1 and what we learned. The creation story is not intended to satisfy all of our modern curiosities. Its purpose is to reveal who God is and why God is worthy of worship. The same goes for Genesis chapters 3 through 11. Actually, our modern curiosities can sidetrack us from the central ideas of these stories. It isn't that historical questions are inappropriate or a waste of time, by no means. The point is that focusing on those questions does little to encourage thinking through the central questions of these chapters. What does God want us to know about Him and His world? So let's address that question first by looking at what role these chapters play in the book of Genesis as a whole. Notice that chapters 3 to 11 connect the story of creation to chapters 1 and 2, to the story of Israel's ancestors, which begins with Abraham in chapter 12. The paradise of Genesis 1 to 2 is lost in chapter 3 as a result of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, the first humans. The remaining stories in chapters 4 to 11 tell of the effects of that disobedience for all humans. To use traditional Christian language, these chapters describe the fall of humanity and the spread of sin in the world. Another way of putting it is to say these chapters describe the problem of sin. Then Genesis chapter 12 begins to describe the solution. God calls Abraham and promises to make a great nation through him, a nation later called Israel, a nation through which the nations of the world will be blessed. God's plan to redeem a sinful world is through Israel. Through Israel, God will bring blessing to the world. Israel will be the means by which God reverses the curse described in Genesis 3 to 11. To appreciate where the Genesis story is ultimately going then, let's explore the details of chapters 3 to 11. First, the story of Adam and Eve, so well known to many people, is not a story simply of temptation to sin. It is a story of trust, or better, the breakdown of trust in the form of disobedience. The serpent casts doubt into Eve's mind about what God really said in Genesis 3, verse 1, and then lies about the consequences in verses 4 and 5. What the serpent says is, God doesn't want you to eat of this fruit because if you do, you'll be just like God, and that will make him jealous. Rather than trusting and obeying the God who made her, Eve allowed suspicion to take hold. After she and Adam eat of the fruit, they are indeed given knowledge, but it is of their nakedness. The knowledge they gain produces shame, not power. The consequences are immediate. A curse is pronounced on the serpent, on Eve, on Adam, on the earth itself, and they are expelled from the garden. Immediately following this story is the story of Cain's murder of Abel. The parents' act of disobedience spreads to their children, and a murder is committed. Recall that God created human beings, according to Genesis 1, in God's image and likeness. And it was only after humans were created that God pronounced his creation very good. This is the crowning achievement of creation. The immediate effect of Adam and Eve's disobedience is their own son murdering their other son out of jealousy. Human life, the crowning achievement of God's creation, is disregarded by Cain. Murder enters the world. He too is now cursed. Next comes the story of the flood. Hundreds of years have passed, and the text records that wickedness and evil had completely taken over the world. This time God's response is much more than a curse. This time God determines to start over completely. Now, I do not want us to dismiss the familiar mental images of the ark and the animals, the waters covering the whole earth, the rainbow, but consider this notion of starting over. Think of Noah as a new Adam. Unlike others of his time, Noah was righteous and blameless, according to Genesis 6:9. In Noah, perhaps, all of humanity could get a new start. If God could just start all over with him, creation could conceivably go back to the way things were before all this mess happened. But starting over in this way did not reverse the curse. No sooner do we finish reading the flood story than we find ourselves reading about people building a tower to reach up into heaven in Genesis 11. This tower is not just a big building project people could boast about. It is, like the fruit in the garden, another means by which humanity strives to be like God. In fact, these types of buildings, known as ziggurats in the ancient world, were religious symbols. Square buildings with steps going upwards, stairways to heaven, with a shrine on top. This time, in the face of humanity's arrogant disobedience, God's response is to scatter the peoples throughout the earth and confuse their one language. Now, presumably this means more than just confusing them, but creating other languages to divide the people into other nations and language groups. Clearly, something has gone dreadfully wrong, so wrong that even starting over with Noah did not resolve it. Something deeply wrong has happened to humanity. A more drastic solution is required. Beginning with Abraham, God will choose Israel as his tool for starting over. But as the drama of the Old Testament unfolds, it will soon become apparent that Israel is not able to fulfill its purpose. The stage is set for someone else, blameless and righteous, to fulfill Israel's mandate to reconcile the world. The final reversing of the curse will not be seen until long after Abraham, but the need for that drastic and ultimate solution can only be understood by paying close attention to these first stories in Genesis.